Welcome everybody, this is Hetek World, our English language news channel, and today's guest in our studio is Jonathan Tobin, Editor-in-Chief of the Jewish News Syndicate. Thank you for being here.
Well, thank you for hosting me. It's great to meet you.
It's so great that we have a chance to talk in person. As a journalist and the Editor-in-Chief of GNS, you, as I could see, you frequently interview your guests via Zoom or in virtual way, and so do we, because we can reach almost everybody in the world in this way. But it is much better to talk to each other in person. Could you just explain a little bit what is the purpose of your news site?
We are an international Jewish news wire service, as well as a website, as well as a YouTube channel. We are the go-to source of news about Israel and the Jewish world online, and I think a lively and important pro-Israel source that covers both the Middle East and the conflict and life in Israel, as well as Jewish life elsewhere, in a way that no one else is doing, because we are sort of without the sort of anti-Israel bias that is so prevalent in the secular media, and without the sort of left-wing orientation that colors even much of the Jewish news media. So we're playing it straight, telling the story of Israel, telling the story of the U.S.-Israel relationship and Jewish life in America as well, in as comprehensive a manner as possible. I don't think there's any other English language site that has as strong an Israel bureau as we do. We also have a very strong American bureau, so we cover a lot of American politics. So we're the place to go if you want to know what's going on there, as well as sort of the nexus of the U.S.-Israel alliance. And a lot of great columnists like Melanie Phillips, Caroline Glick, Ruthie Bloom, myself also, as editor, and many others, as well as a really strong news bureau, both in Israel and in the United States, as well as correspondents elsewhere.
It is not easy today to be a pro-Israeli journalist and running a news site covering Israel from a positive aspect. What is your experience? Which formats are the most effective today, reaching your viewers, bring out your opinion?
Well, the thing about journalism is that we must always go where the readers, listeners, and viewers are. It's not good enough to just say, well, print, we like to write, and that's the sort of most comprehensive format. You have to provide people with sort of the news, the opinion, the analysis that they really are hungry for, especially in times like these, with the war in the Middle East, as well as political turmoil pretty much everywhere. And you have to do it in a manner that is best for them. And while we do provide, a website with comprehensive articles, if you want to read, we give you plenty to read. But we also are increasingly emphasizing our podcasts, our videos, our YouTube channel. Wherever you get podcasts, you can listen to our a number of different podcasts that we produce. So you have to go where they are. I mean, the truth is, people don't. I know Hetek is still in print, and I salute you for that.
Thank you.
And the websites, and I take great care and great pride in our website. But the truth is, increasingly, certainly in the United States, I know this is true, people are not reading pieces of paper, and they're not reading, even going to websites. They pick it up from their social media feeds. They are going to, their podcast platforms or to YouTube, so you have to provide them with material there. And it's just the sine qua non of being a journalist today. You can't produce a newspaper as if it was 1890 or 1940 or even 2002. Those are gone. That's over. You have to do it for the way our readers consume news now.
Sure. What can you do when young people are watching 15-second TikTok videos? How can you explain such complicated issues in the Middle East or the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? Is there any chance, or you can just leave it out because it's impossible?
Well, you cannot explain any topic, even one, let alone one as complex as what is happening in Israel, in 15 seconds. You can't explain anything in 15 seconds. What you can do is give people, pique their interest. You can go to them and say, here, look at this, and draw them in. Hopefully lead them to learn more. Try to, make them think. I end every podcast of mine is with the catchphrase, keep reading and thinking for yourself. I want people to think. Our goal is to make people think, not to tell them what to think, but to give them information and allow them to learn. I think young people are eager to learn if you catch their interest. Not everyone has an attention span of only 15 seconds. Some people perhaps do, and you're never going to fully explain things to them. But our goal as journalists is to explain, and we have to do it in the best way we can. And sometimes that takes the form of long-form journalism. I was an editor at Commentary Magazine, a monthly, which writes long articles. I still contribute to them. That's one form of journalism for sort of high information and readers who are ready to, who are willing to sit down. Not everybody is like that. I don't know that it's solely a matter of generational. Obviously, generations are part of it. A lot of older readers, I don't want to say old readers, older readers are as interested and as addicted to podcasts as the kids are. And again, you have to just reach them.
Well, at least we have more than 15 seconds now, so we can we can try to explain in detail a little bit. And there are many big issues today facing the Jewish community, both in the United States and in Israel. And of course, the October 7th is on everybody's mind. We know that the conflict did not start on the 7th of October. Still, the commentary we can read on the daily basis in the mainstream media tries to explain that, it started on that way, and Israel is doing excessively revenge on the Palestinian people. So, how do you see the 7th of October? What is the importance? Was it a watershed in the conflict, or just another stage of the same?
I think the answer is both, because it was clearly a watershed moment, because it ended sort of an era, certainly for Israelis, of believing that they could live with Hamas in Gaza. For 20 years, really 17 years, since Israel withdrew every Israeli soldier, settler, and settlement from Gaza in 2005, Hamas took over in 2007, turned it into a terror state. It was an independent Palestinian state in all but name, run by Islamist terrorists and Islamist tyranny. And I think most Israelis, from right to left, including Prime Minister Netanyahu, were ready to live with it. They didn't want to go back into Gaza. They didn't want to fight a war in Gaza. They just wanted to let them live on their side of the fence and leave us alone. And they were willing to make all sorts of concessions, including allowing Qatar, which is linked with Iran and is an ally of Hamas, to funnel cash to them in order to just buy peace. Just fine. Just do whatever you want in there. But that was clearly never going to work in retrospect. And October 7th proved that Hamas's goals were never coexistence, were never even just to hold on to Gaza. It was to destroy Israel, to destroy the one Jewish state on the planet, to slaughter as many of its Jews as possible, and from their point of view, all is the optimum. And that in a sense is a watershed. Now, it is also part of a continuum in a 100-year war that the Palestinian Arabs have been waging against Zionism. They want to turn the clock back, not to October 6th, not to June 1967, not to even November 1947, when the UN voted to create a Jewish state and an Arab state, which the Arabs rejected. They said, no, thank you. We want just no Jewish state. They want to turn it back to 1917, before the Balfour Declaration. In essence, they actually want to reverse what existed before 1917, because, of course, there was a large Jewish community in what is now Israel. The Jewish presence in the land of Israel had never been entirely extinguished. They want to reverse it entirely. So you can see this war as just another chapter in that. But it is a watershed, because it kind of blew up a lot of Israeli illusions, but it also exposed, it sort of ripped the mask off of the quote-unquote critics of Israel, who have always said, well, Israel's just being mean to the Palestinians, and they're not trying for peace. The Palestinians just want coexistence. They want a two-state solution. October 7th proved there is no two-state solution, if there ever was one, because the Palestinians have rejected one continuously for 75 years, and indeed exposed anti-Zionism all the more clearly as a form of anti-Semitism. Because, let me just make this very clear, if you are saying that one Jewish state on the planet is one too many, if you're saying that the Jews have no right to self-determination in their ancient homeland, if you're willing to deny rights to Jews, the right to live in their homeland, the right to defend themselves, never mind sovereignty, rights that you would never think to deny to any other people on the planet, then you're practicing a form of discrimination. And the term of art, as our friends the lawyers would say, for that kind of discrimination against Jews is anti-Semitism. So it just exposed it. And certainly what we've seen across the planet, apparently not so much here in Hungary, which is very nice to see, is anti-Semitism, open hatred for Jews. It's been a watershed also for American Jews, the majority of whom are very liberal. Maybe, even those who support Israel, not so supportive of Israel's current government, and who were very confident, for fairly good reasons, that America was still exceptional, that this was a place where there had never been state-sanctioned anti-Semitism, where Jews had found a unique home in the diaspora, unlike any other. In the last 2,000 years, Jews were secure. Jews were accepted, basically to the top. You could be anything if you were Jewish, except maybe a cardinal. There was no limit to Jewish access to the rise of Jews in any sector of society. And yet here, in the institutions, especially in the institutions where Jews felt most at home, elite universities, popular culture, that is where we've seen open anti-Semitism. That has shocked to the core many Jews, many of whom were not, right-wing, were not alarmists about Israel, not even especially pro-Israel activists. I've had, liberal Jews that I know who don't really talk about these sorts of issues now say, I don't know where I can send my child to school now. This country is not the way I thought it was. This is incredibly shocking. And we don't yet know the consequences. We don't know how this is going to play out. So yes, October 7th is part of a continuum of history. Anti-Semitism is nothing new. It's an age-old virus. The war against Israel is very old. But what's been happening these last 8 months is new, unique, terribly troubling, and we need to think seriously about it.
That's very interesting, because do you think that the American Jewish community feels that they have been somehow betrayed by the government on the following days of the October 7th massacre, we could see very positive signs from the American government. President Biden flew to Jerusalem, Tel Aviv, showing solidarity with Israel. But since then, we can see that somehow they want to bind Israel's hand, not to finish the war, not even in a situation where not all of the hostages are freed. So what is the feeling of the Jews living in the States?
Well, you're entirely right to characterize Biden's and the Biden administration's attitude towards Israel in the last 8 months in that way. The president and his entire foreign policy team have been talking out of both sides of their mouth the entire time. And
ironclad
support, and yet doing everything to hamstring, to delay, slow down Israel's efforts to get at Hamas, supporting the goal of eradicating Hamas, and yet doing everything to prevent that goal from being achieved. So this has been, and indeed even with holding back arms, pressuring Israel in ways that would be considered unconscionable. But if you're asking me, do I think this will provoke a sort of mass defection of Jews from the Democratic Party, my answer is no. We are living in the United States in a hyper-partisan moment. I mean, this is the most partisan moment in memory. It's a bifurcated society. Part of it is a media issue. People do not read, listen, watch the same media. They come to very different conclusions. They isolate themselves from people with opposing views, not merely because they watch different media, but because of social media. You can what does social media allow you to do? It allows you to isolate yourself from anybody and any point of view that doesn't confirm your pre-existing conclusions and prejudices. So Republicans and Democrats are at each other's throats. They see the world very differently, and the majority of Jews in the United States are Democrats, and the odds that they will not vote for Biden and will vote for former President Trump solely on the basis of Israel are very low. Now, some will, but the voters who prioritize Israel, for whom Israel is the litmus test issue, are generally Republicans. They're or Orthodox and tend to vote, more likely to vote for Republicans. I think there will be an increase in the Republican vote, or at least it would appear. I'm very very reluctant to make political predictions. It's a fool's errand, especially we're now still 5 months away from the election. All kinds of crazy things are happening. This is an insane political season with the trial of former President Trump. Half the country considers that lawfare, considers it the stuff of banana republics, and the other half of the country is happy to see him thrown in jail, thrown off the ballot. We're in a crisis of democracy in the United States. Jews are part of that. They're part of that debate on one side or the other. So I don't think that most of the voters who don't prioritize Israel are prioritizing it. But I would expect there will be a diminishment of Democratic support. Instead of 70%, it might be 60% this year. Now, will that make a difference? Maybe not. Jews are concentrated largely in states like New York and California and in the red state of Florida, where they're not so much, where a few tens of thousands of Jewish votes are not going to make the difference in the Electoral College, which is how we elect our president. In Pennsylvania, where actually I do live, might make a difference. Pennsylvania is a battleground state, as we say. But again, that's not how the presidential election is not going to be decided by Israel foreign policy. Americans, I hate to say this, most Americans, even in an era like now, are not that interested in the rest of the world unless they're forced to. And while Jews are more interested in Israel, they're likely to decide their vote on other issues.
You mentioned Jewish vote and its importance in the presidential elections, but there was another another group which could be influential, and this is the Muslim vote. And I've just read that President Biden's and the government's attitude towards the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is influenced by the hope for getting the Muslim vote. And we could see a movement by the progressive, most radical Congress people from the Democratic side that they criticize President Biden even in that diminished form and support for Israel. How do you see that?
To understand how the issue of Israel plays out on the broad stage of American politics, you have to start with this basic fact. The two political parties have essentially exchanged identities over the course of the last 60 years. If we were having this conversation, say, 60 years ago, different people, but then we would have spoken of a Democratic Party that was overwhelmingly pro-Israel, a Republican Party that was divided about it, not so much with a large anti-Israel faction, but a large percentage of Republicans were just completely...
The GFK era. Roughly.
Yes, Kennedy, Johnson, into the Nixon era. Republicans were largely indifferent to the issue of Israel. That changed over the course of the last several decades. Democrats are now the party that is split on Israel. The progressive, the intersectional wing, if you will, of the Democratic Party is increasingly hostile, increasingly anti-Zionist. It's some of its most prominent members and spokespersons, the congressional squad being, sort of the icons, but they're far from alone, are virulently anti-Israel, virulently anti-Zionist. That's rooted in the ideology of the hard left as it's grown, the sort of critical race theory, intersectionality. They wrongly defame Israel as a white, a white oppressor, which makes no sense. The conflict between Jews and Arabs is not about race. The majority of Israeli Jews are themselves people of color by the definitions of the American left because they trace their origins to the Middle East or North Africa. And so the Democratic Party has a large anti-Israel wing. Indeed, it is now maybe half the Democratic Party. And it is the louder part of the Democratic Party, the younger part of the Democratic Party, of which Muslims are a small part, very influential in the state of Michigan. The White House is obsessed with Michigan. The Republicans, on the other hand, dominated, as they never were generations ago, by evangelicals, conservative Christians, are lockstep pro-Israel party. It is, I could name for you the number of Republicans of any note who are not enthusiastic supporters of Israel. Republicans are entirely pro-Israel. Indeed, Donald Trump could never have become the nominee of the Republican Party in 2016 for all of his, unique appeal, which surprised everyone, had he not made it very clear that he was pro-Israel. That was a litmus test for evangelical Christians who are really, in many ways, the backbone of the pro-Israel movement in the United States, even more than American Jewry is. I mean, that's something that Trump can never get over. He continually complains that he doesn't get the Jewish vote, despite being the most pro-Israel president we've ever had. He just doesn't get it. What I explained before about Jews not prioritizing Israel. So we start with that the Republicans are the pro-Israel. If you look at the polling numbers, Republicans back Israel by 90% of Republicans are pro-Israel. Democrats, it's maybe 40% at best. Independents, it's 60, 70%. So it's skewed in this way. The Democratic base, which Biden worries about in a base election, is unhappy with him because they consider him too pro-Israel, even though the pro-Israel people are rightly complaining about the way he has undermined Israel. And what has happened in the last several months, we've seen him sort of sending delegations to Dearborn, Michigan, which is sort of, as the Wall Street Journal called it, the jihad capital of America, with its pro-Hamas mayor and, large Arab population. basically bending the knee to them, saying, "No, we're sorry. We said these pro-Israel things. Trust us. We're with you on this." It's deeply ironic because one of the main talking points of the critics of Prime Minister Netanyahu, who has plenty to account for, I mean, I'm not here justifying him, is that he's playing politics. He's prolonging the war to shore up his own political flanks. In fact, the person who's playing politics on the war is Joe Biden, and has been all along. The vast majority of Israelis support the war, don't want Hamas to survive and to be in power in Gaza because they know then they'll never be safe. Because then the hundreds of thousands of Jewish refugees, the most underreported story about this war, the fact that hundreds of thousands of Israelis have been forced to flee from their homes in the south and in the north. You know, if you go to Tel Aviv now and you walk along, the beach where all the hotels are, you see all the hotels are filled. They're not filled with tourists, although there are some, thankfully, but mostly they're just, middle-class Israelis, people from, southern farming communities that were overrun or nearby. The whole envelope along the northern border with Lebanon and controlled by Hezbollah, they're all there in hotels because they can't be in their homes because it's not safe. They can't go home until this war is over and Hamas is defeated. It's Joe Biden who's playing politics on this issue. He shouldn't be doing that, but yet that is what he's done because he worries about his left flank, his anti-Israel left flank. He wants this war to be over on any terms, even if it means Hamas's survival, Hamas's victory, and Hamas's survival does mean Hamas's victory. Even though it would put an end to any illusion about a two-state solution. Let's face it, if Hamas is still alive when the shooting stops in this war, they are the winners not just of the war, they are the winners of Palestinian politics for the foreseeable future. They will have justified themselves and exposed their supposedly more moderate Fatah opponents who control Judea and Samaria, the Palestinian Authority, as weaklings. And this is a disaster. It's a disaster for the Palestinians. It's a disaster for Israel. It's a disaster for the world because it means, a guarantee of more Islamist terrorism and a victory for Iran and its long arm of international terror. Yet Biden is doing this in large measure because he and his foreign policy team really don't want Israel to win, and also because they think that's what their party wants.
You spoke about this complete change between the two sides of the American politics, but sometimes it is not reflected in the American mainstream media. Quite often I can read titles and news stories in the New York Times and other sites blaming President Trump of being anti-Semitic or his supporters being some kind of fascist-minded people. And President Trump is blamed because of his close connection towards leaders like the Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban or the former Brazilian President Bolsonaro and other and of course Prime Minister Netanyahu in Israel. So will there be ever? Can we ever read about the reality in these newspapers, or it just remains the same?
Well, I spoke a moment ago about the sort of sea change in American politics and the way the parties have changed. Journalism has changed. We all know it. The New York Times, its business model was to be down the middle. It was, the party of the establishment, the newspaper of the establishment, the newspaper of record.
All the news that fit to print.
All the news that, yes. But now it is, it's a completely different business model. It's not just, the political prejudices. They are firmly on the left. That is reflected in their news reporting, that is reflected as well as their editorial page. They're not alone in this. Much of the American media, which is sort of on the left, liberal, is like that too. There's an editorial in every headline, in every news headline, in every news story. It extends to everything they do, including the arts and the sports. There is no, there is no middle of the road when it comes to these publications, and that's why people don't trust the media. That's why the media is, as I said before, bifurcated. People rightly do not trust the New York Times, the Washington Post, the liberal media to tell the truth about things which, the liberal media wants them to think. Some of them turn to more conservative media, which can be accused of sort of being on the other side. But when it comes to the difference is that the Times still pretends to be objective. So does the Washington Post, and they are treated as such. The broadcast networks play this game too, CNN, when in fact they're openly partisan. I mean, you might as well just ask the Democrats what they think as read the New York Times. And I'm not saying that as a partisan point. It's just a reality. You have to. Any educated reader, any educated person, always should have known to read everything critically. But nowadays, the notion, and certainly in the history of the American media, there was a period, sort of post-World War II, in which sort of there was a cult of objectivity, in which people certainly pretended at least to try to be objective. There's no such thing as pure objectivity. We know that. That's gone. It's completely gone. And I think many of the people in these publications, especially the younger generation who see journalism as a form of activism, we've seen in their reactions to the, sort of Black Lives Matters, mostly peaceful riots in 2020, how that played out in the newsroom of the New York Times was very instructive as to the decline of the media, the decline in trust in the media, and everything that has happened since only worsens this crisis. We are having a crisis in democracy in the United States right now as we speak. I can't tell you with any great assurance how it's going to play out. I'm more worried about the future of the United States than I have ever been. I'm still, at my heart, I still believe in American exceptionalism. America is a different kind of country. It was created as a different kind of country. But we're going through a real crisis. And hopefully we'll come out of it. America survived the 20th century defeating, Nazism, communism, imperial fascism in Japan. It's hard to believe that it will fall now to sort of the progressive left, which is part of a general war on Western civilization, which is played out in academia. It's related to more than just politics, more than just the crisis in Israel. It's about what we believe about ourselves as a nation, what we think are the values that are important. That's what's playing out now, and we're in the middle of it. And the only thing I would say is one of my professors at Columbia a long time ago when I was in college, and I studied history, not journalism, and he told me, one of my mentors said, that everything in history is evitable. Nothing is inevitable. We walk backwards into history with our eyes firmly set on the past. We don't know what's going to happen. We have to hope and pray that the right prevails, and by that I mean right, small r, not capital R. It's not a matter of politicians and parties. It's a matter of the values that created the American experiment. And if those values fall, that's a catastrophe for the whole world, not just the U.S.-Israel alliance, not just the situation in Europe. That's, to me, is the big story, and that's the thing that we should be most worried about.
Let's speak about Europe then. As we speak, there are only some days left until the European elections that will take place also in Hungary as well. And interestingly, foreign policy is a major topic in the election debate, both in Hungary and the other parts of Europe. And part of it is the image of the United States. There are people who say that America is trying to gain on Europe using the war in Ukraine, trying to get a larger influence on the European politics, and they are the winners. They gain most of the war, and Europe is going down economically, militarily. And and that's quite many people. We can see from the reactions to our news stories and podcasts as well that people are not looking at the United States the same way as after the fall of the communism, when it was just land of the brave, land of the free. So, how do you think, are these complaints are justified?
Well, I guess the first thing I need to do in reaction to what you've described, I'm sure accurately, a lot of sentiments, is that, like a lot of conspiracy theories, that doesn't really wash. I mean, America's reaction to the war in Ukraine has been, a series of confusions. The notion that any sizable percentage of Americans are at all interested in sort of gaining advantage over our European partners is an illusion. The truth is, Europeans are, by definition, because there's so many countries in close, they're so close to each other, people speak different languages. You have to live with each other, and indeed live with the consequences of two great wars in the last century, and of the lessons that we hope we learn from in never allowing that to happen again. Americans are not that interested in the rest of the world. I hate to break this to you. Most Americans don't speak another language. Some speak Spanish because there's so many Hispanic Americans now. Americans don't want Russia to overrun Europe. We, as John Quincy Adams wrote nearly 200 years ago, or actually 200 years ago, we are friends to democracy everywhere, although guardians only of our own. We generally root for democracy elsewhere, but we're not, the idea that most Americans, or really any sizable percentage of Americans, have any ulterior motives about this. Now, Americans are divided about the war in Ukraine. Not that there's any sizable sympathy for Putin or belief that Ukrainians shouldn't have the right of self-determination. They just don't know why that Americans now are being asked to spend $150 billion a year on a war in a place with in a conflict that they don't really understand or care about, or doesn't seem to many of them to be in any way linked to American national interests, other than they don't want Ukraine to be overrun. Some Democrats, just to explain it, there are some Democrats that embraced Ukraine because they saw it as somehow linked to their dislike for Trump, because Ukraine got involved in one of the controversies with Trump. There's a certain percentage of Republicans that are for any war. They follow the flag. And there's a lot of Cold War nostalgia in terms of they long for the simplicity of 1988, when the Russians were the bad guys and we were opposing them everywhere for the cause of freedom. And yet, this doesn't seem to be the same conflict. I mean, the forces of the Warsaw Pact are not in Central Europe ready to overrun Western Europe if the United States and its nuclear deterrent and its forces in Germany are ready to resist them. So there's a lot of confusion about that. I think Europeans are kind of reading sometimes too much into American politics. I would imagine that no matter who wins this election, America is going to be more interested in settling the war in Ukraine. If there is any country that Americans are worried about, it is not Russia, it is China, which they rightly view as the real geostrategic threat to the United States in this century, and worried about how can we aid Taiwan and preserve its independence. So basically, we're stripping our army and all of our reserves to throw into this furnace of sort of World War I style stalemate in Ukraine. I think even Democrats are largely going to tire of writing, signing on, paying the bill for this war, and with the certainty that we'll be asked to pay the bill for the reconstruction whenever it ends. So I think Europeans should view it in that light. I think Americans also don't know what to think about NATO. NATO isn't what it was in 1987. It's now so big, it's a little more incoherent. We support the independence of all fellow NATO members, even the ones that we have no sympathy for, such as Turkey, which is like basically no place in an alliance of Western democracies. I think Trump, sort of spoke for many Americans when he was president. He was like, pay for your own defense. Why are you asking us to do it? Americans are worried about like the fact that there doesn't seem to be very much security on our own southern border, and yet we're spending incredible amounts. I mean, maybe not so much in the big picture of a U.S. budget, which is so many trillions I couldn't even tell you how big it is. So that's, I think, and I think there are many people in Europe who might think, oh, this is isolationism, and I think that's too is a simplification. I think even those politicians who are labeled as the most isolationists within the Republican Party are not isolationists. They just want to pick and choose. I think one example is Senator J.D. Vance of Ohio, who is like one of the most articulate of what is sort of the America First, and Trump chose the America First slogan for his foreign policy because he thought it sounded good. Of course, we were for our country first. Isn't everybody for their own country first? Without thinking that it had some resonance for any people, who remembered what that phrase meant in 1940. But people who identify as American First in 2024 are not, clones of what, they're not anything like the real isolationists, which we had in 1940, people who wanted no part of European wars, people like Charles Lindbergh, who were anti-Semitic and were perfectly fine with Hitler doing whatever he wanted in Europe. That is over. I think people like Vance say, that I think he coined a phrase that when he said foreign policy isn't a fairy tale. We can't pay for every conflict everywhere. It used to be that our armed forces had to be prepared for 2 wars at a time. The truth is, in our current state of our economy and having drawn down our armed forces since the fall of the Berlin Wall, that it's not clear that we can fight 1 war, let alone 2 wars or 3 wars. Can we aid Ukraine, aid Israel, aid Taiwan, aid Europe, defend our own, interests elsewhere? It doesn't seem to exist. We're not the arsenal of democracy anymore because all of our blue-collar jobs have been exported to various parts of the third world, including China. So we're not in a position to have, to do that without a major, revamping of our economy, which, while I think there's a lot of lip service being paid to the fact that we do have to be more concerned about being able to produce the arms that are needed to protect ourselves and our friends, we're nowhere close to doing that. And neither party is going to take the kind of hard decisions in order to make that happen. I think that's very unlikely. So Europeans should understand that Americans are their friends. I mean, there's no sentiment in America really of hostility towards, we're more in your heads than you're in ours. I mean, let's to use a sort of pop culture phrase, we're not that concerned. The most Americans are not thinking about, gee, what do the Europeans think about our what we're doing? They're not even thinking about it. They're basically friendly to Europe. They like Europe. They, so many Americans have, their origins are in Europe. They like to visit it if they can, although most Americans don't travel abroad. I mean, we're a very insular people in that way, just as our defense has always been a function of oceans and continents and not rivers and the sort of narrow borders and concerns that Europeans have always had to live with. We're kind of, an insular people, despite the fact that world events drew us out onto the world stage in the last century. So as I said, as Adam's sentiment about being friends to democracy everywhere, but guardians only of our own, it's always going to be the prevailing sentiment. And that's not even a partisan divide. So I think Europeans should always sort of pull back on trying to read too much into every single thing that happens, thinking that what Americans are doing is based on their intentions towards Europe, and to understand that America views it from a completely different, most Americans, even the foreign policy establishment, the people who really think about these issues, view it in a very different way.
Okay, we love to see this friendly face of America, really, because we we like America. Basically, we like America.
I hope
that's
so.
I only refer to this feeling of certain confusion, seeing these tendencies and the traditional friendship of America showing towards Europe. But we started our conversation with the October 7th events, and this day also influenced the European nations, the state of the European Jewish diaspora, and the politics of the European states. We can see that countries after countries are accepting today the so-called Palestinian statehood. So far, 4 of them, Spain, Ireland, Norway, and then Slovenia just a couple of days ago. How do you see the future of the European Jewish community? Do they face the same threats as in the States, or even bigger threats?
Well, I, as an American and an American Jew, I don't want to speak for European Jewry. I'm speaking as someone looking from the outside. So let's be clear. I'm an observer.
Okay.
American Jewry at its, is going through a crisis, which I spoke of. It's nothing like the situation for European Jews. European Jews are living in a very different political environment, a different historical environment. And, the assumption of American Jews is that we're here, we're the same as, we are, there's no question about our rights or being viewed as an alien presence. Everybody's an immigrant in America. Sure, there's anti-Semitism, but there's no comparison to the history, even within living memory, of anti-Semitism, even in countries where now Jews are welcomed. And, we're sitting here in Hungary, where it's clear that Jews, can feel safe and are not under threat. But obviously there's history. And so that we start from a different sort of starting point. I think in countries where there is large Muslim immigration, where there's I spoke of Biden caring about Muslim votes in Michigan. There are only like a couple 100,000 in Michigan. I mean, there are far more American Jews than there are American Muslims, let alone Palestinian or Arab Americans. In France, it's a completely different situation. In Britain, it's a completely different situation. That plays out in terms of, and I don't want to catastrophize this or make it to exaggerate an already serious problem, but obviously Jews are living in countries where the majority of people are hostile to Israel, echoing anti-Semitic statements about the war, and there was anti-Semitism already in a way that, quite frankly, doesn't exist in the United States at its worst. As much as American Jews are shocked by what's happened, it's not to be compared with what's been going on in Western Europe, places like Sweden. So obviously, I think Jews have reason to be worried. American Jews, when they visit Europe, are told to remove their kippot, their stars, their jewelry, let alone if you're dressed as an Orthodox Jew and you're sort of wearing a sign around your neck saying I'm a Jew. That's not something that one thinks about, in the United States, except in sort of the worst neighborhoods where you could be in danger, no matter who you are. So obviously, European Jewry is in crisis. It's not clear what the future of the Jewish communities in countries where there are large, hostile political factions, where there is this bizarre red-green alliance of sort of Islamists, political Islam, and the political left, who join in this sort of, antithetical positions on so many issues, but agree on their distaste for Israel, their hatred for Israel, and their, quite frankly, hostility to Jews. I'm not sure how that plays out. I don't want to play prophet. I mean, I'm not Herzl writing. We're in the land of Herzl.
Okay.
And Jabotinsky, his famous Tisha B'Av speech in 1938 that the Jews have to be evacuated. They were prophets. They were right. European Jewry, had a death sentence hanging over it. I'm not making, I'm in no position, and I'm not sure that that is the same position now. We're in a different world. There is in Israel. There's the blue and white flag flies over Jerusalem. So Jews are not weak. They're not homeless. And, in America, Jews are still a force, and the pro-Israel community is still a force. But clearly, I don't know how large, thriving communities can continue to not so much survive, but to thrive and to feel, an integral part of their countries in this sort of cultural shift where this Red-Green Alliance is so influential, which, they can put hundreds of thousands of people into the streets of Paris and London and other cities, which clearly, this is aimed at Jewry. It's not just protesting an action of the state of Israel. So that's a real crisis. And it's also, when we see countries where Jews are safe, where it would appear to me, I'm a visitor, all the evidence that the Jews of Hungary feel safe in a way that the Jews of much larger Jewish communities in Europe don't feel safe. That's encouraging. But is Hungary the outlier, or is it the way things will trend? It's hard to make that argument that Hungary is the pattern that other European countries are going to follow.
At least we are trying to keep it that way in Hungary, and that's one of the major issue for the weekend's election. Jonathan, thank you very much. It's been so great talking to you in our studio in person, and not for 15 seconds.
Well, thank you so much for hosting me, and it's been a pleasure to speak with you.
And I'm looking forward talking to you maybe in a virtual way in the future before the American elections, because that's something very exciting in the coming 5 months. Could be, somebody told that anything could happen. Black swans, so-called.
I think we've already had a couple of black swans already this year, but I'll be happy to speak with you as we go forward. It's been great meeting you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for everybody watching us. If you want to follow the Jewish News Syndicate site, I will put the link to the description. There are great opinions, articles, reviews on this site, and we are waiting for you with other programs as well after the election day on Sunday here in Hungary. So see you next time. Bye.